What is going on, guys? Welcome to the Reformed Reader, the channel where we review different forms of media through the lens of a Christian who is under the authority of the scriptures. My name is Josh, and today we're going to be doing a book review of Kingdoms of Death by Christopher Ruocchio. Now, before we get any further into this video, I do want to give a disclaimer and say there are going to be very light spoilers here, as this is book 4 in a 7-book series. So, you know, if you haven't read book 1 yet and you're wondering whether some characters make it or not, that may get spoiled, but otherwise I'm going to be as spoiler free as possible. So before we dive into the review, let's go over what is this book about. Hadrian Marlowe is trapped. For nearly a century, he has been a guest of the Emperor, forced into the role of advisor, a prisoner of his own legend. But the war is changing. Mankind is losing. The Cielsen are spilling into human space from the fringes, picking their targets with cunning precision. The great Prince Siriani Doriaika is uniting their clans, forging them into an army, a threat the likes of which mankind has never seen. And the Empire stands alone. Now the Emperor has no choice but to give Hadrian Marlowe, once his favorite knight, one more impossible task: journey across the galaxy to the Lothrian Commonwealth and convince them to join the war. But not all is as it seems, and Hadrian's journey will take him far beyond the Empire, beyond the Commonwealth, and possibly deep behind enemy lines. Alright guys, so the way that I normally structure my reviews is that I go over the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good being the things about the book that I enjoyed, the bad being things that maybe didn't work as well for me. These are preferential things, but then I go into the ugly, which is what could be some sin that is steeped into this work that might hold a Christian back from picking it up, and I break that down into 5 categories. But without any further ado, let's jump right in and go over the good. So what were some things about this book that I enjoyed? Pretty much everything that I loved from the first 3 books, a lot of which was amped up in this one. So the characters, obviously, we're following Hadrian. Yet again, this entire story is about Hadrian and about...
Man, you are one pathetic loser.
This entire story is Hadrian's story. We understand from the first page that Hadrian makes it out alive. So, you know, I guess spoiler alert. We know that Hadrian survives. We know that the entire story is about him committing genocide, essentially. And so, yeah, we're following Hadrian. So the characters are fantastic. You still sort of have your motley crew cast with Corvo and Polino and Krim and Ilara and Ilex and Aristides and all these other characters. You still have that motley crew that we had at the end of book 3, but there's a little more character depth here, and it almost entirely focuses in on Hadrian. So whereas the first book in particular really focuses on Hadrian, the second book you really start to get woven in to some of these side characters. In the third book, you're sort of established with these characters and you just kind of learn to love them more and more. But with this book, you're really laser focused on Hadrian himself, a lot of his inner monologuing, learning the way that he thinks, the way that he's processing these things, the way that he understands leadership. So this book is really, really focused, like laser focused on Hadrian. And obviously we're going to see a lot of Valka in this book as well, but still, I will say she is much more of a side character in this book than I think she was in books 2 or 3. So the characters are fantastic as always. The plot, again, the plot is the reason why you're reading these books. You have to know not just what happened, because we know what happened, but how it happened, how these things came about. What is actually going on with the Quiet? What is going on with the Watchers? What is going on with the Cielsen? How did the Cielsen even come to be or come in contact with humans? You're really learning a lot of that. And then we really start to get into a lot of the Cielsen culture, if you want to call it that. Maybe the Cielsen barbarism is a more appropriate adjective there. So the characters are great. The plot, again, is just... I mean, it's one of the best book series I've ever read, if that tells you anything. The pacing is pretty spot on. You know, I had some pacing issues clearly with book 1. They seem to tighten up quite a bit in book 2. Book 3 was really tightened up until the end for me, and this seems to be its most tight story. I don't think there was anything in here that is fluff, that is excessive, that shouldn't be. I think that this book was really edited down, and if you know the history of the book, not meaning like the fictional history, but the history of Rockio writing it, that'll make a little more sense. I'll leave that for somebody else who has done a much better job and knows a lot more about it than I do. But it's really interesting, by the way. I highly recommend you look into that. It's really, really interesting. But the pacing is just spot on in this book. So plot, characters, pacing, the setting is pretty neat. Again, I love that we do tend to spend quite a bit of time on certain planets, but that we're not stuck there. And so you really get that palate cleanse at each stop. Each planet is distinct. And again, the prose is pretty accessible. I'm not going to say that this is like the easiest book I've ever read. This is not a Dresden Files book, if that makes sense. This is not something that's sort of like, here are the words that convey this thing. Rockio is much more intentional about not just the words, but his turns of phrase. He really understands how he can evoke emotion using a certain sentence or paragraph, or even describing the mannerisms of other characters reacting to dialogue. All those things really shine in this book. So if you like Dune, I know everybody compares this series to Dune, and Rocky is probably sick of that. But what I want to kind of hone in on here is that if you like Dune and you like a lot of that, the inner monologue or a lot of the mannerisms, the political intrigue, but maybe it just seemed like maybe a little too linguistic in nature. Maybe Frank Herbert was trying to be a little flowery or show off a little bit. Rockio does that much better. He does it so much better. This is the perfect way to explain that political intrigue and that inner monologue, and our characters recognizing these mannerisms, these small traits or reflexes that really mean a lot. So it's just fantastic. So for the good, pretty much everything. I absolutely love this book. It was a 10 out of 10 for me. But this does lead me into the bad. What were some things about this book that I didn't enjoy? And there were two things. One was outside of Rockio's control, and I will get to that in a minute. The first thing was the Commonwealth. I really wasn't a big fan of the Commonwealth. I won't get into it just to avoid spoilers, but when Hadrian is there at the Commonwealth or with the Commonwealth, however you want to say it, and he's trying to convince them to come to war, their setting was pretty bland, which it's supposed to be. It was pretty bleak, but it was also just kind of like, I just didn't care. I wasn't invested there. I wasn't really invested in the story with Hadrian and with the Lothrians. I just kind of didn't care. I understood why it was necessary. And again, that's not a to detract from Rockio. That was just a preferential thing. I was just kind of like, I know that we're not going to stay here. I know that this is like a pawn's move in the entire game of chess. There is going to be something consequential that occurs, but otherwise, like, I don't really need to know all this. And so I did catch myself every once in a while, because I was reading it physically and also listening to it. But I would catch myself during this time sort of like wandering off. Whereas the rest of the story, if I was listening to any part of it, really had its hooks in. So the Lothrian Commonwealth, it was kind of, it's fine. You know, I didn't think good or bad. It was just kind of like, this is a device used to move the plot forward. The other thing is, and again, this is something outside of Rockio's control, is that we had a pretty major event in the United States this past week, and I got to a major section of the book, the major section of the book. And there was a death that really shocked the American culture. And I was right in the middle of this section, and to quote a friend of mine, I just sort of lost my appetite for reading. I just found myself not wanting to pick the book up, or any book up, really. I just was disinterested, because I'm like, hey, there are real life things of importance, real life things that matter going on, and I'm reading a book about space wizards and aliens, and it just, you know, it just kind of it really pulled me out of the story, and it kind of sucked the fun out of it, especially the section I was at. I was in the altar scene, for those of you that have read it, and you're wondering what I'm referring to without going over spoilers. Yeah, I got to that scene, or that section of the book, and where that was supposed to sort of be, I would say, like the crescendo of the story, I was just like, I just found no desire to pick up a book. And so it did tarnish my reading experience with the book. It didn't make me like the book any less, but I could really see where I had gotten to a certain point to where I was like, okay, I'm not going to go to sleep until I finish the story. That's kind of where I was at that morning and around noontime. But then after that, I just had no interest. So that did kind of stink. But again, it's not to detract from the story. It's just I'm just expressing to you guys what my reading experience was like. So if you don't have something major like that will pull you out of a story, I think the story will really set its hooks in you and it won't let up. So this leads me to the final category, which is the ugly, which is what could be some sin that is steeped into this work that might hold a Christian back from picking it up. I break this down into 5 categories and I rate them out of 10, starting with violence and brutality. For violence and brutality, I'm going to give this a 9. This was a brutal and violent book. This is one of the most brutal books I've ever read. So I will say this book lived up to its name. There's a lot that goes on. It is really brutal. It is really violent. But ordinarily, if something creeps up into the 9 category, that's sort of giving me pause about whether or not I should continue reading it convictionally. I will say that the violence and brutality was so escalated, and yet I did not find myself convictionally going, maybe I shouldn't read this. There were parts that were brutal, that were violent, that were horrific, that were meant to be. There were sections that were detestable and made your stomach churn and caused goosebumps to raise on your arms and the back of your neck in a terrifying type of way. And he designed it that way on purpose. We are beginning to see the Cielson for what they really are, if you haven't already. If you don't know, then by the end of this book, it's just time to clean house. There's not enough room in the universe for humans and Cielson to coexist. So yeah, the violence and brutality is very high. I definitely think if you're squeamish, this is probably not going to be the book for you. I've actually heard some people say I've had to skip sections because of how brutal and horrific some of the events are, and I understand. But it never brought me to that point. I never caught myself going, maybe I shouldn't read this. It was just like, whoa! So I'll say if you liked Dracula and some of the dread and horror in that book, this has some of that. But this also has some like Gears of War type elements, and you guys may know what I'm talking about, and if you don't, that's fine, but if you do, you know exactly what I mean. There's a lot of gore that goes on in this book. This is more of a horror book than most of the horror books I've ever read, if that tells you anything. So yeah, violence and brutality is going to be high. Category 2 is going to be sexually explicit content. For sexually explicit content, I'm going to give this a 1. Now, I really kind of debated on whether to give this a 1 or a 0. I don't remember there being anything in there. I actually was about to give it a 0, and then I thought maybe there's something in there that I don't remember. I don't think there is, but there could be. And even if there is, it is extremely tame. There's nothing sexually explicit, like truly explicit in this book. It would not pertain to the story at all. It would be a throwaway, and there are no throwaway paragraphs in this book whatsoever. So I don't think Rocchio would waste his time with throwing something in there just to be like, oh, I'm going to throw some shock factor in there. I don't think so, but I'm going to leave it at a 1 just so that somebody can't go, ooh, you're wrong, because I very well could be, but I don't remember anything. So category 3 is going to be language. And for language, I'm going to give this a 6. It's about where the other books were. Again, this is, there are a couple of characters in particular, looking at Paulino, who is a more rough and gruff individual that doesn't really care what other people think and doesn't really care if other people think that you should or shouldn't use profanity or expletives. So he just does. He's a warrior. He's an ex-gladiator. I mean, this guy has been through a lot. And so you kind of excuse it to a degree. Not saying that I'm like, oh, it's fine. But yeah, there's some heavy language in here every once in a while, but it normally comes from those characters. And it's usually when those emotions are really peaked. So this leads me into category 4, which is gratuitous inclusions. For gratuitous inclusions, I'm going to give this another 0. Yeah, there's nothing gratuitous in this book, nor should there be. It's just not there. And finally, this leads me into dark themes. Now, with dark themes, I also include heavy themes. So for dark themes, I'm going to give this an 8. Yeah, this is a horror book. This is a cosmic horror book. This is Sun Eater horror. That's the best way that I can describe it. It can get really, really heavy. Now, as far as dark themes, talking about in a spiritual sense, there's nothing really here. But if I'm talking about heavy themes that are really going to weigh heavy on your conscience, at least for some, there's some scenes in here to watch out for. Again, there's nothing that caused me to question the book convictionally, but there's some things in there where I'm like, whoa! Like, not only did some of these characters cross the line, but they completely disregard it and dove headfirst over. There's some really dark stuff in here. There's some dark, as in like there's some really heavy, violent things. So yeah, the dark themes and heavy themes sort of tying in with the violence and brutality here. So if you can't handle like heavy violence and brutality, this may not be for you, because it does get heavy at times, especially considering some of the people that these things are occurring to or around or about. It can get pretty heavy. So this leads me into the final question, which is, would I recommend this to a Christian? And the answer is yes, I would. But again, it just depends. I would obviously recommend this to somebody. If you like the other books, you're going to like this book. For me personally, I liked this book as much as Howling Dark. Howling Dark's ending still has a very emotional high for me. I don't know that I've ever read an ending like that. And so it really has just pushed it up there for me. But Kingdoms of Death may knock it off its pedestal. And it's because it is a much tighter story. We don't have to dive into all the nuance of the characters because you already have that with it being book 4. And there are some just huge events that occur here. There are some, Hadrian crosses a Rubicon that we are going to see the ripples of his decisions throughout the rest of the series. And the ending of this book was excellent as well. I'm not trying to say that this book lacks an ending that is as impactful as Howling Dark. It's just different. It impacts you differently. Whereas Howling Dark was sort of an event, something that happened, something that kind of blows your mind. The ending of this book is much more personal. It's much more emotional. And that's why it really had a big impact with me. I'm going to say I like it as much as Howling Dark as of right now, which means that they are tied for Book of the Year for me at the time of recording this. And I'm hoping that when I read the rest of the books that maybe gradually they will knock each other off of that top spot. So would I recommend it to a Christian? I absolutely would if you liked the other books. And if you are invested, yes, press on, because this story is crazy, crazy good. So overall, I absolutely loved it. It's a 10 out of 10 for me. It's another 5-star read. So yeah, Rockio has just mastered his craft. So much so that I could not wait, and I jumped immediately into Ashes of Man. And then I think I'm going to take a break between books 5 and 6. And read Disquiet Gods maybe at the end of October to ramp up for book 7. But yeah, so far, absolutely loving Ashes of Man just as much as Kingdoms of Death, and I'm only a few chapters in. It's just picked right back up. So yeah, am absolutely loving the series. This has been the series of the year for me. So I can't recommend this series enough if you love science fiction, fantasy, with a little sprinkling of horror elements there. Yeah, this is just, it's going to be an all-timer for me. So thank you guys so much for coming and hanging out with me and listening to me ramble about Sun Eater for a little while. Guys, please do me a favor. Like, subscribe, do all the things. But more importantly, Share these videos with your Christian brothers and sisters, because my hope for this channel is that I could be a good resource for my brothers and sisters in Christ, so that maybe we can spend our time, money, and energy a little more wisely on things that honor the Lord. So thank you guys again so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.